29-year-old Mark Duggan was shot dead by a police officer in the chest 3 years ago, but police say he was suspected of planning an attack and was in possession of a handgun. But at the time of his shooting, Duggan was proved unarmed. Joining us in the Now tonight is his aunt, Carol Duggan. Thanks for being with us. As you watch, and I assume you're watching very closely, the case of Mike Brown and what we're seeing in Ferguson, what's going through your head?
First of all, could we, as Mark's family, just send our condolences to the family of Mike Brown? We feel the pain as we're living the pain. Mike Brown's death mirrored Mark's death in the sense that they were both unarmed, they weren't posing a threat to anybody, and they were both surrendering. They were shot dead, and as soon as they were shot dead, then the character assassination started. The media campaign started against Mike Brown, and also the same here in Mark's case. He was accused of being a gangster. He was accused of being one of the 48 most dangerous men in Europe. He'd never been to prison. He had just minor criminal record from being young. So we actually can empathise with what's going on in Ferguson as a result of Mark's death on the 4th of August in 2011. Nobody felt the need to come and tell Mark's parents that their son had been shot dead. The result was the family had to go to the Tottenham police station on the 6th of August to actually report the murder of Mark's death. As a result of that, the family were left outside the police station for 5 hours. Nobody came to speak to us. It got dark. We as a family, we had children with us, babies in buggies. We decided to go home, call it a day. As soon as we left, the police assaulted a 16-year-old black girl and beat her up outside the police station.
You obviously,
that's what
Carol,
started the uprising.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You obviously see a lot more parallels in the police systems of the UK and the United States than just Mark and Mike, so to say. Am I correct?
Yes, of course. There has been a lot of black deaths in custody in Britain. Since 1990, there's been over 1,000 deaths during police contact. So we know in Britain that you are more likely to be stopped and searched as a black man, 8 times more stopped and searched than a white man. There is a lot more deaths in custody, black deaths in custody, over white deaths in custody. So it is becoming, too much and too often.
We saw people come out on the streets after the killing of Mark in 2011. Havoc. It was just havoc out on the streets of London. It was something that the city hadn't seen. What sort of justice are you seeking in terms of Mark's case specifically?
Mark was assassinated, we say executed, by the Metropolitan Police Service. The officer V53, we only know him as V53. He hasn't got a name, hasn't got a face. We really want him to be held accountable for Mark's death. We want him to take off the uniform and to stand in a court and be tried as any civilian would for murder, because he murdered Mark.
All right, Carol Duggan with us in the Now tonight, live from the UK, of course, telling us the story about her nephew, Mark Duggan, who was killed by police back in 2011. Thanks so much for sharing your story. I know it's difficult to remember, but I'm sure...
Can we just, yeah, sure. Can we just say that we'd like to empathise and send our solidarity with the people of Ferguson.
Absolutely.
Because this is what you have to do in order to be heard. You have to come out and demonstrate in order to be heard. If we didn't do what we did, and if Ferguson, the people of Ferguson didn't do what they did, we would never get these deaths in custody even recognised on television.
Well, we will certainly do our best to get your message to the people of Ferguson. Carol Duggan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. No justice, no peace. I
want to take a look at how lethal force works among cops across the world, at least on paper, according to the law. Firearms can be used in countries like Serbia, Bosnia, and the Philippines when people's lives are supposedly at risk. In Venezuela, a policeman can resort to a firearm when other peaceful methods fail. In the UK, officers can pull out guns, but all responsibility lies on them, and they must be able to justify their actions. Pretty funny after we just heard from Carol Duggan there. But in Belgium, firearms can never be used for crowd control. It's against the law. Protests, of course, vary in the way they are labeled depending on the perspective and in the country. Crowd control can easily become a crackdown, a clampdown, or all-out chaos depending on who's describing it. These images were deemed undemocratic and a violation of freedom of assembly by certain governments when this occurred in Hong Kong. Ukraine's security forces crashing a peaceful rally on Maidan, a story told so simply, even though evidence suggested otherwise. And in Russia, no doubt, anti-government protests always labeled a crackdown. Joining us in the Now is investigative journalist Tony Gosling. Thanks for being with us. Of course, you've heard the protests I've just mentioned. Watching Ferguson, this is obviously being positioned as an attempt to control the rule of law. Why do we hear such varying descriptions of protests, maybe even lighter, maybe some even stronger crackdowns, depending on which government is describing them?
Well, Anissa, I think we've got a serious problem in the United States in that the solution, well, at least one of the solutions, has been to send in the troops. Now, this is not a job for the Pentagon. This is a job for the Justice Department. It's a job for the, the economics people. There's not just almost, it seems, a race war attempted to be started in Ferguson by the injustice that's been levelled against Michael, but there's actual social injustice at the back of all this. So you've got two problems of injustice that have led to this this current situation. Ultimately, the local people, of course, are going to be angry about this, but I think they're in the United States, probably worse than in Britain. We've seen over the years actually quite a lot of evidence that there have been deliberate attempts by effectively what is a kind of criminal elite to start race wars. Back in the 1960s, we saw the assassination of Martin Luther King, now quite clearly associated with people involved in the FBI and within the government agencies. And then in 1969, with the Manson murders, there were deliberate attempts in those cases by smearing slogans on the wall when Sharon Tate was murdered to try and make out that Sharon Tate had been murdered by black people. What the criminal elite want, it seems, is for different people from different factions, white or black or any other, to be fighting each other, because then they can't get together, get organised and actually change the way their whole country works, with justice. And actually, I think what's happened with the courts in the US is, in some weird, strange ways, rather similar to Egypt, because the democratically elected Morsi government in Egypt, as soon as they started dealing with criminality in the Egyptian courts, they found that there was a military coup and al-Sisi took over, and the US State Department rewarded them, and Defense Department rewarded them with a massive payout, money that they've been holding back. And there was a reward for the coup plotters because they see, I think, the justice system as a key part of any country. And I think what we've seen is really an assault on the justice system, as we've seen in Ferguson, and a complete refusal by an elite in the US and in the UK, in Mark Duggan's case, to deliver the rule of law, because that is an essential part of any democracy, is that the police, just like anybody else, should be subject to the rule of law. And in Ferguson and in London, in Mark Duggan's case, that's simply not been happening.
All right, Tony Gosling, investigative journalist with us in the Now. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Anissa.